Today we're talking with Erin Marie Olszewski. Welcome, Erin.
Thank you so much for having me. It's good to be here.
Erin is both a veteran and a nurse, and normally our society likes to honor veterans and honor nurses and call them heroes, except when they have something to say that authorities don't want to hear. So today we have someone I consider a hero, and some of you may already know her from some of the videos that she's appeared on, and we're going to get into some technical details that might help illuminate some of the important information that she's been sharing. Before we go any further, for people that don't know you, you are an Army vet.
Yes, yes.
You started when you were 17?
Yeah, so I signed when I was 17. I guess I've always been kind of a rebel. But I was before September 11th happened, actually. So I was in basic training when September 11th happened. You know how everybody remembers where they were? Well, that's where I was.
Yeah.
And so I was like, all right, I guess this is my path. So yes, I actually ended up going to Iraq for. I was deployed for about a year overseas, and so that was my first real experience. As I was 18 years old when I was over there and got back right around age, a couple of years.
So you were part of the earlier wave over there.
Yeah, actually, I was the first wave. Mm-hmm. So
we
were attacked. Yeah. We went up in country, and actually my team was one of the teams out there that took down the Saddam statue, and so I was the first one in the country with the Marines and 82nd Airborne.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then
it's a crazy story.
It's quite a life already at 18. And then you retired from the military. Did you get your nursing training in the Army or afterwards?
Yeah, I didn't retire. I served my years and then I got out. So I think that's one of the words that was kind of misconstrued, I guess, in the video. So, but I did my time and then I got out, and that's when I went into nursing school. So I didn't feel like that was the life for me in the Army any longer. And I always had it in me to be a nurse, and that's what I wanted to do. So I went to school. Even when back in high school, I was a CNA, so I always had that, I loved that area, and I always knew that that's what I wanted to do. So I started out with my LPN, then I went to my associate's RN, and then I went to my bachelor's degree in nursing. So kind of went through all the steps and worked my way up to where I am now, I guess.
Gotcha. Yeah, I guess when people say retired military, that implies 20 years and in a whole process, and you did your time, as you say. And I think anybody that was part of the first wave of the Iraq thing, they did enough. You don't need to do more than that. That's plenty of service. And then you got educated as a nurse. And we can say you live in Florida?
Yeah.
You're Floridian? Yep. Okay. All right, so
well, oh, sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
I'm actually from Wisconsin, so I'm a transplant. So but I do live here now, and I've lived here for a while. So but I'm a Midwesterner at heart.
Gotcha. And raised in Wisconsin. Let's address a big issue right away, and then we're going to get into the details, which is you have the unique experience of being a nurse in COVID situations in a Florida hospital and being a nurse in COVID situations later in a New York City hospital. So for people that don't know your story, in the broad strokes, tell us the difference. We'll get into the details, the technical details later, but the number of people that died, percentage, survival rate, those kinds of things.
So when this pandemic hit, of course, everybody is preparing, and I'm talking, hospital people, like everybody didn't know what to expect, and the whole time our eyes are kind of on New York because they were essentially the epicenter of this, and where I am located, my hospital, we were actually being furloughed. We didn't have anything to do. Like, there was nobody, it was not busy, and nobody could figure it out. So we ended up cross-training around the hospital. So different, I was cross-training all over on different floors. So when this wave hit, we would be able to, do any job needed. So when I got an offer to go to New York to help, I asked my employer if that would be okay, because there wasn't really anything to do. Waited it out enough that I didn't think that wave was going to hit us, which it actually never did hit. And so that's when she okayed it, like, yeah, go. And so that's what I did. Hopped on a plane and headed out to the pandemic epicenter, and I was ready to help, and I was ready to figure out what was going on too.
Gotcha. And again, you're somebody that lived in an active combat zone. You're not somebody who's never seen difficulties. You know how hairy things can get. So you were mentally prepared.
It was very eerily similar to going into a war zone, getting off that plane. And it was interesting because, in a war zone, when you get off the plane, you immediately get to work, right? I mean, when we landed in Kuwait, that's where we went up from, we're ready to go. Mop gear, we're ready, we're going up into... When I landed in New York, we taxied over to a 4-star hotel in Times Square, and we sat around waiting for an assignment for 3 days. So that was one of my first red flags. Like, why, if this is a pandemic and you need nurses so bad, well, why am I not in a hospital already? That was one of those things that kind of... I was, and even like my family and my coworkers, I would be like, we're just sitting here and we're getting paid a lot of money to sit here. The travel agency that I went through was funded through FEMA. And so that's quite a bit of money. We were making $10,000 a week while we were there, which is unheard of. I mean, it is a lot of money. And if I'm not being utilized, I feel like that's such a waste. And,
wow.
A lot of people don't know that part of my story, but it is an interesting aspect, because there were nurses that were there prior to me getting there that sat for 18 days. So why were these resources not being utilized? That's what I want to know.
And this was handled by FEMA. They were the ones writing the paychecks?
FEMA was funding it, but it was the hospitals themselves that were, supposed to be getting, the nurses put into the hospitals. But the whole entire thing, this is why the whole entire system essentially ended up killing a lot of people, is because of the mismanagement. So that goes all the way to just the management of getting, nurses where they needed to go when they needed to be there. So it failed somewhere along the line, and I don't really exactly know who did that, but all I know is that sent off a huge red flag before I even stepped foot into a hospital.
Now, you had mentioned in a previous interview that in Florida there were COVID cases. There were people that came in the door with the problem, and they had a good survival rate. Do I have that correct?
Yes, absolutely. So I was working in the emergency room while we were waiting for the wave. And there would be people that came to the emergency room and with a positive COVID. The difference between how we treated them and how they treated them over in New York is very different. We used the hydroxychloroquine and zinc protocol. That's what people were prescribed. If they were asymptomatic, they were sent home and quarantined. If they were admitted, the very, 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 very last treatment was a vent. That was very unheard of. By the time I left, we hadn't vented anybody. I think they may have put one person on a vent, and that man went home, and he's alive. So, as a last resort, we used ventilators. When I got to New York, very different situation. The hydroxychloroquine was banned for off-label use. If doctors did try to prescribe it, they would likely lose their license and lose their job. And their first line of defense was the ventilators there. So very different treatments and two different places with very different outcomes.
Let's talk about some just sort of nuts and bolts stuff that people need to wrap their mind around. So when you're in a hospital, there's a lot of different players. There's the doctors, there's the nurses, there's the techs, who are very important people. There's the orderlies, the people that do the cleaning and just handle all the really important, very important stuff. And it's every person is important in that team. It's not that one. Without orderlies, you can't have a hospital, right? It would fall into chaos, like within a few hours, right? So there's a lot of people doing a lot of important work, but the pecking order, understandably so, is doctors on top, issuing the orders, and nurses supporting the doctor's efforts, and of course then the orderlies doing their thing, and then techs doing their thing. But there is one wrinkle to this, which is that as a nurse, you have a license, and you are sworn to certain ethical standards. Can you talk a little bit about the ethical training and the ethical responsibilities that nurses have that people may not be aware of?
Well, our code is we're essentially the patient advocates. So if we see something unethical or without integrity or something that's going to harm a patient, we have our duty to report this. We are considered mandatory reporters. And the problem with what happened in New York is that it was essentially a liability-free environment. That was an order it was the executive order under Cuomo. Blanket liability-free environment. So when that occurred, everything kind of went out the window, and people were doing whatever they wanted to do. And you mentioned the pecking order. So above the doctors, and I think this is where it starts, this is where the problem started, is you have the governor giving the orders to the administration. And the administration then brings all that to the doctors, right? So essentially, people without boots on the ground inside these hospitals are giving the orders of how to treat these patients inside these hospitals. So I guess the problem is why is that happening? How are these people that have never been in, they haven't been into these facilities making these decisions for treatment? They're getting involved in between a doctor-patient relationship. So it puts everybody in a really bad position. It puts the doctors in a really bad position because now they can't even prescribe hydroxychloroquine if they wanted to. If they ask for anything, like the high-dose IV vitamin C that Dr. Chang was using over in Asia successfully, then they're laughed at. So they don't have a whole lot of autonomy. So they just literally have to follow the orders that come from above. And that's one thing that I tried to go up the chain of command when I was there and just shut down over and over and over again. Eventually I was kicked out for speaking out and asking too many questions. And that should never happen.
And I want to stress to everybody, it is a nurse's job to speak up, because mistakes get made. Sometimes you have to tell a doctor, "Oh, doctor, this patient was already receiving insulin. I'm just making something up, but don't give him another shot of it because you'll kill him." And the doctor should listen and say, "Oh, goodness, thank you for catching that." But in the environment, it sounds like the environment that was created, and this is very important what you're saying, it was the governor of New York who became the medical dictator of New York City hospitals, I guess New York State hospitals, and he decreed what was permissible and what was not permissible. And we all know he screamed for ventilators, right? He wanted 30,000 ventilators, and if he didn't get them, there was going to be a catastrophe. And the administrators of the hospitals just fell into line. Yeah. And I'm wondering, and you probably don't know the answer to this, I don't know it, maybe we've got a really smart listener who knows, do hospital administrators ever take an oath to protect patients? I have a feeling they don't. I have a gut feeling that they're just administrators and they don't have such an oath, but I could be wrong.
I don't think that there's an oath. They probably sign, some sort of code of conduct with the hospital when they, take that position, to protect and serve their patients. So that's an interesting thing that no one's brought that up yet. But it would be good to find that out.
Because we know doctors have an oath, we know nurses have an oath. These very and as somebody that works in a hospital, the hospital administrator is kind of God. Am I stretching things a little bit there? And when I'm talking about how things actually run?
No, God not at all.
Yeah, in the sense of if the hospital administrator says stand on your head, and you better stand on your head or you're going to lose your job or you're going to get written up or something bad might happen to your career. So the hospital administrators are a very, very important bunch. And so the orders clearly were coming from the hospital administrators who were getting it from the governor's office, who was getting it from where. I did a little bit of research. It didn't require me to be Einstein. The guy that's the head of public health and who was advising Cuomo, he doesn't have a public health degree. He's not an infectious disease guy. He's a anesthesiologist who specializes in pediatric cardiology, which is great. But it really doesn't prepare one for the job at hand, which I want to bring this point up too. It's not like nurses and doctors are interchangeable. Just because somebody has an MD doesn't mean they're prepared to deal with every medical situation. And if anybody doubts that, next time you need open heart surgery, call your podiatrist up and see if he can give you a deal on open heart surgery. So there is specialty within the medical world, right?
Yes, of course, definitely.
So you're going to want, in an emergency situation with a pandemic, with people coming in with an infectious disease, you're going to want a staff of doctors and nurses and techs who have the correct skills for the thing they're about to face. And this, even though this was an emergency and it was a surprise and we didn't know a whole lot, we did know it was a respiratory disease. That was known. We did know it was infectious. So a lot of things were known. So that should have informed the people that were doing the planning of what kind of doctors do we need, what kind of nurses do we need, what kind of techs do we need. So tell me your experience of the personnel that you encountered when you were in the New York City hospital working, their backgrounds. We won't even talk about their competence or their ethics, but just what was their skill set?
That's a really good point. I'm gonna move back and then I'll get to that question. Because you brought up how Cuomo ordered the 30,000 vents, like back in March. So, one, how did he know that we were going to need 30,000 vents? Two, when he ordered those, why didn't he think to order people to run them too?
Mm-hmm.
That was one of the things that was another part of this wheel that is broken. He didn't think that, oh, we're going to need respiratory therapists who usually run vents. Even when you're an ICU nurse, most ICU nurses don't even touch vents ever. Like we don't mess with the vents. The doctors mess with them, and the respiratory therapist, change the settings and that. Like it's not. We can manage the patient. We can manage. We watch the patient, monitor the patient. Keep an eye on the actual patient. They keep an eye on the ventilator. So they could have brought in respiratory therapists from all around the world, if this was the case, or they could have, they didn't. We had one respiratory therapist per shift, per all these floors, maybe two, running around frantically. I mean, these respiratory therapists that they brought in weren't even charting anything because they were so busy. And that right there.
So, I'm sorry to interrupt. So there was a shortage of respiratory therapists, and these people are highly trained, right? This is not like a weekend seminar that they go to, right? This is like a serious profession. Can even though you're not a respiratory therapist, you've worked with them and
Right.
you probably chatted with them. Do you know offhand what's involved in their education? And I imagine this is a serious training that they receive at some point in their careers, and then they, of course, get better and better at it as time goes on.
Yeah, I mean, this is what they do. They work with ventilators. They work with patients breathing. They understand all the lab work and everything that goes into like monitoring these patients. They have I'm not exactly sure of the amount of schooling, but it's not an easy profession. It takes a lot of, it's not something that you can just walk into and then walk out the door and you have a degree. Like this is, right up there with nursing, right up there with a doctorate degree, and a lot of them were very highly trained. So that was another reason, why these patients died too. It was just the wrong staff. The staffing agency that I went with pretty much took every single nurse. If you had a nursing degree, you could come on in. So there was literally school nurses put into an ICU floor. School nurses. Everybody has a specialty. And just because you're a nurse doesn't mean that you know how to do the job of. We have specialties. That's why we're,
sure.
It's not just you just get a degree and you know how to do everything. Sure, we're generally trained when we graduate. We're generally trained in every single area. But when you graduate, you go into like a specialty, and you really know that. And they should have brought in ICU nurses and respiratory therapists, emergency room nurses. But I get in a pandemic, they want to get everybody and everybody. So another problem with that is even they asked what your specialty was, but that didn't mean you were going to be put in that area. So even when we were there and they knew our specialties, they still didn't divide us. So there was other floor nurses that have never worked in an ICU emergency room, put into ICU, given 3 or 4 patients, and they were told to just figure it out. And mind you, when I was there, it wasn't pandemic running around crazy frantic. It was like running like a normal hospital. We weren't any more busy than like a normal hospital on a normal day. It's just that I don't know. It didn't seem like they cared. It was still a liability-free environment. It was just how it's always done, and they're not going to change it. So the nurses that were put with these patients, it could have been switched out. It could have been made right, but they didn't. Nobody cared, So these poor nurses were put in a bad situation. So they tried their best, but it wasn't right.
So there was a shortage of respiratory techs. There were nurses who just didn't have the right training, no fault of their own, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. If you're, or if you're a student and somebody throws you into an intense emergency room, ICU, ICU environment, that's unfair to the nurse.
Yes.
It's unfair to everybody. So, but you just made a really interesting point that I want to make sure everybody got. The volume was not the problem. It was the configuration of the personnel. So you're saying that the volume was like a normal, busy ICU environment, yeah?
Yes. Yes.
And so, but the franticness came from the fact that, number one, you had a shortage of trained techs, which is disastrous. And we're going to get into the details of what it means to be on a mechanical ventilator, because I think people don't understand. They hear the word vent and they kind of like, okay, I guess it's a medical thing, whatever. Erin and I are going to get into what that means. It's not exactly rocket science, but it's pretty darn close, and it's a very talk about intrusive medical practice. I mean, it's an intense thing, and with Cuomo sort of say, I need vents. Well, do you know what a vent is? Do you know what it means to intubate somebody? So we're going to get into that. So I guess the reason I'm going off on that is when you have a shortage of respiratory techs, that's like not having a guy to drive the bus. It's like, hey, we're going to put a bunch of people on a bus. We're going to just put a brick on the accelerator, and we don't have a driver, or we're going to have a guy drive 5 buses simultaneously and hope it works out. It's not going to work out. People are going to die, right? Or am I exaggerating?
No, I use a similar analogy when I was talking to somebody else that, here's a car, and I realize you're only 12 years old, but you're going to just have to figure that out. And then everybody does it. It's just, it doesn't make sense. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that if you're going to order 30,000 vents, you should probably also make sure that you have people to run them. People have literally lost their lives because of this. And
gotcha.
And now, it's creating, it's terrifying people around the world that are looking at New York as the epicenter, and they're like scared in their homes, thinking that this COVID is absolutely so deadly that everybody's just dying, and there's freezer trucks and they're dropping like flies, but they are not being told the truth. And so that's what I'm trying to do. It's just
gotcha.
Tell people
gotcha.
This is what really happened.
Gotcha. So, Liz, to take a step back for everybody, Erin worked in 2 hospitals, one in Florida, one in New York City. In Florida, people didn't die. In New York, the vast majority died, and we're beginning to get a picture of why. A shortage of respiratory techs, not the right mix of personnel, because nursing is, like everything else in this world, is a specialty. And if somebody doesn't have ICU experience, putting them in an ICU is not a good thing. And I think of all the nurses and even the techs, and probably some of the doctors who must have been traumatized by being in this situation. You're in a no-win situation where people are unnecessarily dying, and you're there trying to hold the thing together, and there is no really way to hold it together because the whole thing's configured incorrectly. But let's talk about some of the specifics now of how this works. So let's talk about patient intake. You talked in another interview about the strange, or it seems strange to me, methodology by which patients were admitted and identified as being COVID or non-COVID, and then how they were treated and how they were moved around. Can you talk a little bit about, from the point of view of a person coming in off the street with symptoms, what did they experience, how were they herded around, and then what happened to them in the New York City hospital?
So this is another spot where things went wrong. So I'm just going to kind of compare my hospital to how these people were admitted in New York. We worked with the individual in Florida, so we would look at the big picture. Could this be COVID? Possibly. Could this be anxiety because you're terrified because everybody's dying and you're scared now you have it, most likely. We would test them for the flu first, get that result back, and if they were negative, then we would test them for COVID. So we didn't jump right to COVID. In New York, everybody was potentially COVID. They didn't look at anything else. You could come in for there was a stroke. Sure, we know COVID may have caused stroke symptoms, but you don't get to treat it like that until you can rule it out, right? And or anything. They would just, everybody was a COVID patient. Everybody was another dollar sign, essentially. And so a person could come in having a panic attack, and that's probably COVID in their mind. So they would be admitted as a COVID rule out. They would take a test, which had a 5 to 10 day turnaround, even though there was a rapid result test available that they didn't use, which is another reason things went wrong. And then they'd be admitted to a floor, and on that floor were other COVID positive patients. So if they didn't have COVID, then the likelihood of them now getting it from being admitted to a COVID floor were pretty much, it was likely that they were going to get it, and most of the time they did.
Well, if this is infectious as they say it is, then if you put a non-infected person in a ward with a bunch of infected people, you're inviting that person to get infected, right? I mean, it's just common. But that's how they did it. So in Florida, when somebody came in, they would say, "Well, let's find out what this isn't. It's not the flu because we just gave a flu test. It's not this. It's not that." And that's normal medical practice. You don't just, everybody that walks in, they have the disease of the day. That's not the way medicine works. Right. But in New York City, that's how it worked. They went straight to the COVID suspicion.
Yeah, yep. It was just kind of the way of life there. And everybody thought it was normal because that's what they've always done, and nobody really wanted to hear anything else. So
when you say that's what they always did in that context. That wasn't the way they always practiced medicine.
Well, during the pandemic, I should rephrase that. So like when this all first started happening, it just turned into everybody pretty much probably has it.
So the laws of normal medicine and normal common sense were just thrown out the window. If you walked in the door of a hospital with virtually any complaint, you were a COVID suspect.
Yes.
And they tested you, and you point out that instead of doing the rapid test, they did the multi-day test, and that if they decided to keep the person, they put them in a ward with people that they knew were active COVID patients, whether they knew the person had COVID or not.
Yeah.
What determined whether a person stayed in the hospital? Because I know a lot of places would treat people and send them home and ask them to self-quarantine. Were they basically taking everybody that walked in off the street and putting them in a hospital bed?
I wasn't in the emergency room there, so I don't know exactly how the admitting process worked. But I was on the floors, and I can tell you that the minute that an ICU bed was available, there was already a patient in there on the vent, on the same vent that the deceased patient just got off of. So it was essentially an assembly line to a body bag. So wow. It just worked. It worked that way. So I can't tell you honestly from my perspective how people were admitted, but I do know that many people were admitted to these floors that didn't need to be admitted at all.
And I realize you won't have a hard number here. Maybe I'm just asking for an impression. What percentage of the people that ended up in a ward ended up on a vent?
I mean, they pretty much turned. I've only been in the ICU,
Gotcha.
So everybody was on a vent. my friends that worked there, my fellow, I guess, travel nurses that were on a non-ICU unit would be transferring many of their patients to the ICU unit. So that's hard. That's hard to pinpoint because most people that I saw were, either not, going to be on event soon or already on event. So there was a man that, they would admit to the unit knowing that they were going to put him on event when they didn't need to. It was very strange. It was a very strange practice, and I really don't have a lot of answers because none of it really makes sense.
And they basically, as soon as the event opened up, they had another person on it right away.
Yeah. Event never rested.
Okay. When people were put on the wards in sort of a holding pattern, were they made to wear masks? Do you know? I know you may not know.
And you know what? I think in their room, no.
Okay.
I never saw. I would see some people, not everybody, so it wasn't consistent.
Gotcha. Okay. The reason I bring it up, and it's becoming clear that mask wearing alone can create hypoxia. And I'm wondering how many people went to the hospital with some other type of problem that had a mask put on them, that after several hours, when they did their oxygen saturation test, discovered, oh, this person's, got a bad number, let's vent them. Now you told her, but that's just a speculation on my part. Now you talked about a guy that appeared to have nothing more than an anxiety attack. And this is a really hard story to hear, but people need to hear it to understand the kinds of things that were going on. So can you tell a little bit about that story?
Yeah. So this was a younger man that presented to the emergency room with, difficulty breathing, other symptoms. Now, I don't know. I mean, I obviously wasn't in the emergency room, but that's what his chart stated. And essentially, he was admitted, and he was put on a BiPAP, which is a less invasive. It's a breathing machine. It's pretty commonly used. It's safe, effective. A lot of people use them, even at home. They'll have them overnight if they have sleep apnea or something. And you have to think, if you think as a patient, you're terrified. You're going into this hospital that has been all over national news with freezer trucks of bodies in the back, and you're going in there with symptoms of difficulty breathing, etc. It's terrifying. And so and they're being admitted without family members with them, so they are completely alone in this. And they get admitted to these rooms. Everybody is dressed in head-to-toe PPE. So you can't really tell who anybody is. They're walking around. Everybody looks scary. It's not a good look. Everybody's, you can see people's eyes. That's it. You can't hear them. And you're this patient that they're taking care of. So you're coming in the room and you're losing that connection, because you look terrifying. These patients are terrified. So these machines are very uncomfortable on people's faces. So it causes even more anxiety, because now they can't even really talk because they have a breathing machine on their face. So their anxiety is going up. They're getting really uncomfortable. I'll just say in my hospital, if in that type of a scenario, we would have gotten a staff member to sit with this patient in their room and just comfort them and be by their side and hold their hand and walk them through this and take the time to just work with them and take care of them. That is what would have saved his life right there. That is the moment that would have saved his life. If they would have taken the time, and I wasn't with him during this time. A friend of mine that I worked with on this unit was. And what happened with him is that he just like, I just can't keep it on. I just can't, he was just getting really restless, and he was worried and scared. And the residents, the residents ruled the roost there. Residents have finished medical school, but they don't have any hands-on clinical experience, so they can't work alone. So the thing that they, did is, okay, well, if you can't handle that, either you're going to probably die if you don't get on a ventilator. And that's how they coerce these patients into signing their own consents. So he didn't want to sign it. This is what my friend told me, and I mean, from looking into his, in the background, it made sense to me that he didn't want to do it. He was terrified, but he's like, you know what? If this is going to save my life, I guess this is what I have to do. Not knowing any better, not having any family, not having anybody to advocate for them, because the nurses didn't have much say. If you start questioning that, you're moved or kicked out. So sure, he ended up on an event.
And it's fundamental to medical ethics that a patient needs to know the risk of any procedure that's proposed for them. And we're going to talk about what it means to vent somebody in a second, because I bet 99% of the people on this call who've heard all about ventilators for the last 4 months have no idea what it means to be intubated and on a vent. They have no idea. So I have experience of being in a New York hospital and being I'm physician. I'm going to guess it was a resident because it was a very young person. Trying to talk me into a really invasive and turned out to be unnecessary procedure, expensive procedure, by the way. Now I was lucky. They had I had gone in. I basically just fell over. I got sick really fast. I went from being like 100% to not even be able to hold my head up in the space of a half hour. And I thought, maybe I'm having I don't know. I'm not a doctor. I thought maybe I'm having a heart attack. I was 3 hours in the waiting room. Then they put me on a gurney. This is like normal. This is like not COVID era. This is just a day in the park in New York City, right? Then they put me on a gurney with a drip. I was in the hallway. They put me in the hallway. I was laying there in the hallway alone. No one took, and talked to me. No one, anything for 6 hours. And I was really too weak to move, And finally, somebody comes to me and they want me to get that thing where they inject something in your veins and they put you in an electric machine and the CTR or CRT. I don't know. But
so they wanted to give you contrast dye and put you in probably a CT scan.
Yeah, and now at that point I was starting to feel a little bit better, and I figured, look, if I've been here 9 hours and nobody's worried about me, there must not be anything that bad with me. I'm going home, so I went home. But she was pushing me so hard to get this thing done. It was like it was a lot of pressure. So let's talk about the doctors. A resident is somebody who's a recent grad of medical school or a current medical student, or what does it mean to be a resident?
Being a resident is that you completed the book portion of medical school, but you haven't completed the clinical hands-on portion.
So do they have MD degrees or not? Do they have a medical degree?
They do, but they're not able to work on their own until they complete their residency. So it's kind of like nurses. Nurses do the same thing. We have to have a certain amount of clinical hours in order to practice independently.
And you say that they have to be supervised, but were they supervised? It sounds like they were making all kinds of calls without any obvious supervision, especially when let's say this, a nurse that's been practicing for many years is going to have more practical hands-on knowledge than a resident. I'm just going to lay that out there, and I think that's just common sense. One has book knowledge, the other has been working with human beings for years. So residents could make mistakes, they could have judgment errors, they could have gaps in their education, they could have not understanding what it is they're actually doing at that moment. Is that fairly fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. And for anybody that's listening, think if you've ever been in a hospital or ever had a family member in a hospital, you see the nurse 99% of your stay, and the 1% you'll see the doctor making rounds, looks you up and down, okay, makes the orders. So the nurses have the hands-on patient care, and that's what we do. Like, we're good at it. That is our entire passion in our, career. And that's fine. That's why I don't want to be a doctor, because I love having the patient interaction. So yeah, these residents haven't had that hands-on. They've been in a book, but they haven't been in front of a patient. And that makes a really big difference in patient care, because it's body, mind, and soul. You have to look at the emotions of these patients too, not just their symptoms, or not just the lab numbers that you see up on the computer screen. There's a lot that goes into taking care of a patient outside of, just what the objective, symptoms that they're showing.
And there were stories, I believe you told some, and there's another nurse that was that came forward who said, sometimes the residents made big mistakes based on their lack of experience, and some of them wouldn't listen and just sort of went ahead with things that were injurious to the patients.
Yeah, ego got in the way. Ego got in the way of a lot of patient care, because it's hard for a doctor to admit that they're wrong, and a nurse who obviously has, in their mind, less training than them is trying to correct them. So it was a huge power struggle, and it's like that on a good day in the hospital. And I know that most nurses would contest to that. Most of them are terrified to even speak to a doctor. So it's that type of an environment, the hierarchy, and it's costing patients their lives and their health. And this is outside of the pandemic too. So we really need to, as a society, look at our healthcare and how it's set up and reform it, so it's working for the people instead of working against them.
Gotcha. And as you pointed out earlier in the call, this was decreed a liability-free zone, so there was even less supervision. And were these residents supervised? I mean, was anybody watching the residents or directing the residents or giving, from a higher level saying, hey, guy, you got to be careful with that? Or were they just cut loose
It depended on the attending. The attending is who was in charge of the residents and the fellows. So it depended on who the attending was. I had a couple of attendings I never even saw. I had no idea who they were because they never came into the unit. But the residents ruled the roost in some of the ICU units that I worked in. And then there were others that were really good. They were, rounding with the residents. They were teaching them. They were training them. They were teaching me some things. So it can't put a blanket statement that every single resident and every single attending and every single fellow or nurse was bad. But essentially, they were outnumbered. So let's say you have a really good resident and a really good attending doctor on day shift, and then those guys go home, and a new round of residents and attendings take over and just ruin it. So you get back in the morning, and now your patient is probably not going to make it because it was just poor care given. So, that caused a lot of problems. And then there was really no consistency. So the residents and the attendings went around in groups. And the group would stay for a week and be taking care of these patients. And then they'd go to a new unit, and we get a brand new set of residents and attendings taking care of. There was just no consistency in care. And that's huge. The continuity of care for patients, to have I would stay with most of my patients every single day. I knew them inside and out. I knew everything about them. I knew where they were from. I mean, when you're taking care of a patient, you get to know them. Even if they're on a vent, I would be talking to their families on the FaceTime. I would be doing the best I could. But these residents didn't have that same experience. They were moved around, switched around so often that there was really no way to be able to keep up with the progress these patients were making along the way.
That's incredible. So how long would a resident stay in a given scenario? A week? 2 weeks?
Yeah, usually a week, and then they would go to a different floor. And they were just rounding all over. Like I said in my video, in my opinion, the residents were essentially just practicing their skills, because it was the mindset of the majority that, well, they're not going to make it anyway, so it is what it is. And
wow,
that was really hard for me to swallow, because so you're not even going to try? You guys aren't even going to try? You're just going to give up? Like, they have a fighting chance. Like, some of these patients had a fighting chance.
Yeah.
The guy I mentioned earlier with the bypass, that we actually extubated him, put him on a bypass, and then they re-intubated him, and he died. He was 35 years old. He didn't have to die. And I knew that, and everybody knew that. And actually, I have a recording of a doctor saying that he didn't have to die. He said that a sitter would have been a good idea, and that probably would have saved his life. But, oh well. And that was the mindset, and that's why all these people died, because nobody cared. They were seen as, disposable. A lot of them, the majority of patients admitted, were very low income, from, a lot of poverty. And they're just viewed as disposable human beings. And that in itself just should make anybody just stick to their stomach.
Yeah, this was a public hospital.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. And I don't know the details, and you may not know them either, but there's information that people can look up themselves that there was some kind of special payout from Medicare, Medicaid, that if you diagnose somebody with COVID, the hospital automatically got a big check. And if you put somebody on a vent, the hospital got an even bigger check. Does that ring true to you?
Yeah, so that's another thing that I question. I don't understand why the government would, incentivizing $11,000 for every single patient admitted for a COVID positive or a COVID rule out.
What's a rule out, by the way? What does it mean to rule out, a COVID rule out?
Those are those patients that they would test in the emergency room and would be awaiting their results. So they still got paid for them to admit them.
So even they call it a rule out, but that in normal English we would think, oh, we've ruled it out. He doesn't have COVID, but it meant something else in this weird world.
Oh, yeah, awaiting results essentially. So
and they still get paid as if it were a COVID patient?
Yeah. As far as
wow.
I know. Okay. I'm 99.9% sure, because that entire hospital turned into a COVID hospital. They made the whole hospital COVID. And so that meant either COVID positive or COVID rule outs. So you got to, pretty much everybody is a COVID rule out, And,
wow.
and to get more money, if you vented them, then you get another $39,000. And
wow.
in a poor hospital that needs money, and these people are from low-income population, and there's no family in these rooms, the likelihood of going on a vent is pretty high.
Wow.
Because a lot of money is involved. And like I said, the vents never rested. So once that patient, died, there would be a new patient on that same vent within minutes.
Hey, we've been talking an hour, and I want to be respectful of your time and your emotional state, because this is heavy stuff to be talking about. Can you go a little longer, and let's talk about what does it mean when you intubate somebody, and what does it mean when somebody's on a vent? Because I have a feeling 99.9% of our listeners who've heard this thing, vents, have no idea what that means. Would you mind talking about that?
Yeah, that's fine. So when you're put on a ventilator, you are essentially giving the machine permission to breathe for you. And in order to do that, you have to be paralyzed, so you can't move. And you also have to be sedated, so you don't wake up. It's essentially a medical-induced coma. You can kind of compare it to being under general anesthesia while in surgery.
Okay.
And to do that, you need to be given a lot of different paralytics and sedatives. And at that point, you're completely reliant on your caregiver, your nurse, your doctors, your residents, especially when you don't have any family in the room. You're just on a bed, on a ventilator that's breathing for you, and on a whole lot of IV medication going into your veins.
And this is a really important point, everybody. It's not like they give you a pill and you fall asleep. How many wires, how many intravenous things are hooked up to a single person who's on a vent? It's a lot, right?
Yeah. Average is usually about 5 or 6 different drips. Some people had all the way up to 12, 13, 14 drips. As you're on the ventilator longer and longer, you progressively get worse. Every single day that you're on a ventilator is one more day that you probably won't get off of it. They're meant to be the last resort of all the resorts. Like, this should never, ever be a first line of defense. If you absolutely need it and you cannot breathe on your own whatsoever, then it has to be done very, very carefully. And in a normal situation, we would never do something like that to a patient, putting them on a ventilator without really, truly needing it.
So that is the most extreme last chance. We've exhausted every conceivable possibility. We know we're going to probably kill this guy just putting him on the vent. Not that we're trying to kill him, but it probably will kill him. But we've exhausted every conceivable option. That's normally how someone goes on a vent. Okay, and so what they did in New York City and in other parts of the world, and I think they did it in northern Italy too, is they just put you had a breathing problem. We think you have COVID. We're going to put you on a vent. And so, as you point out, that's 5 to 6 intravenous tubes going into you, maybe as many as 12, 13, 14. And then this is kind of these kind of obvious things that people don't think about. How do you drink or eat when you're in that state? How are you fed?
They would do tube feedings, which they'd put another little tube down your throat into your stomach and drip tube feedings. And it half the time they wouldn't even be doing that. And the fluids, they wouldn't normally run any fluids because the patients were getting so many fluids just from the medications alone that they just completely skipped the IV fluids. So your food consists of almost like an Ensure being dripped into your stomach, and that's it. That's what you got. So, and the fluids were your medications. Yeah.
Wow. So you're already sick with something. You're on half a dozen or more powerful drugs. These are not trivial drugs, right? Isn't fentanyl one of the drugs that they sometimes use as a painkiller?
Yeah, we used that. That was pretty consistent. We used that pretty much with every single patient, and then they used a lot of propofol. These are all drugs that you're not going to see used as much as they were being used.
So the person's already got a health condition. They are being given 6 to 14 different super powerful drugs. Their only source of nutrition now is a tube into their stomach. Sounds like, all right, there's liquid in the drip, but they're not getting fresh water. and this is going on day after day after day after week. And so when people say people have died of COVID, I'm not asking you to speculate, and I'm going to speculate. They could have died just by going through this procedure, because it would kill a healthy person, right?
Yes.
And then, not to get gross, but we got to understand what we're seeing here. How does somebody, take care of their elimination when they're in a coma? I mean, this is also a difficult, unhealthy, not great circumstance, right?
Yeah. Well, a lot of them had the indwelling Foley's, which for the urine collection, and then for stool, we'd just have to clean them every single day. And that's another thing. Half the time, they weren't being cleaned properly. There was a patient I took care of that had dried feces all the way up his back that had probably been there for weeks. So it's like, how are these people in some of these, how can you go into the healthcare profession and not want to help people? And that goes without saying, like, that was the kind of the mindset of this entire hospital was, well, they're going to die anyway, and they're not awake anyway. But for me, I could not look at this and not say something. Like, these patients and their families, they deserve at least that. They deserve somebody to speak out for them, because obviously they weren't able to speak out for themselves, or they wouldn't.
There was another nurse, I think one of your colleagues, someone that you know now, and she said that she'd come to work and be sent to care for patients, and when she went to their rooms, they'd been dead for hours. Yeah,
Nicole Sirotech. She lives in Nevada. Yeah, we connected after my video went out. I ended up calling her. I had seen her video while I was still in New York, and I was so thankful. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm not the only one. Like, it was like, and at that time I was already recording. I already knew that I was going to be coming out with this. But I needed to stay in that hospital because I needed to give these patients a fighting chance. Like, the ones that I was taking care of, like, I wouldn't even leave their rooms, because I wanted to protect them. But when I got kicked out, I'm like, all right, this is it. Like, I reached out to Nicole, and it was nice. There's a lot of us, actually. There's quite a few nurses and especially respiratory therapists that have contacted me. They're not ready to speak out publicly, but just wait, because there's going to be a lot of us coming forward, and hopefully, with that video I opened the gate, so people don't have to be afraid. And I don't want any, and nobody should be afraid to be able to tell the truth and just get it off your chest, because a lot of people are living with what they saw. We saw some awful things, and just to keep that inside and not say anything is traumatic, so.
Absolutely. And it's a true, this phrase is used all the time, thank you for your service, and it's just a throwaway thing people say. But, one of the hardest things is to speak out in an environment like this. And we know it's hard because not many people have done it yet. You and Nicole are among the very, very, very few. And it's so essential. You know it, and I hope our listeners get this. And listeners, if not, thousands of nurses and techs and physicians experience stuff like this, and only a tiny handful have had the courage to step up and put it on the line. And this puts you and Nicole and others at risk. It's just a fact. You're going to get flashback from people, and it's just part of the deal. But it's very hard to do, and I want to thank you for doing it. There was some talk about the possibility of some attorney getting involved in this. Is anything developing along those lines that you're aware of? Because sometimes I think at this point that's our only salvation right now is the court system, because all kinds of stuff can go down in a declared emergency, But once it's over, then it's the matter of the laws of evidence. And you can't just tell people to shut up. People can present evidence and talk about what actually happened. So do you know any legal actions that are being taken on behalf of the people that died in these hospitals and their families?
I will say that I am represented by multiple attorneys from multiple different specialties, and I can't touch on that right now, but I will when I can.
Fair enough. The one last thing I want to leave everybody with, and let me see if I can find, I've got all these screens open, but across the country, the percentage of deaths in the states that reported very highly skewed to nursing homes and other institutions where people are, they're stuck in one place. They have a medical problem of some kind, extended care, those kinds of places. And, some states mentioned 30%, others mentioned 40%. I think there are some as 50% or more. And what's so strange is New York City, at least to the recent numbers that I saw, is very low percentage-wise, even though the governor in New York State basically commanded the nursing homes to take actively infectious COVID patients, which was, insane.
Yeah.
But then when you look at the numbers, you think, well, are they underestimating how many nursing home people died, or was the sheer volume of poor and low-income people in the public hospitals who died, were those numbers so huge that because New York State's the only one with, I think, a 17% rate of nursing, of all the COVID deaths attributed to COVID, and we all know how problematic that is because, what people died of is never clear, and it's certainly not clear in this situation. But let's say those numbers are true. One state says 30%, another state says 40%, another state says over 50%, and then New York comes in with, well, only 17% of our deaths were nursing homes, and that makes me wonder, well, did the bulk of the rest of the deaths come through hospitals like the one you worked at? I don't know. This is now we're in a speculative area. I don't have the answer, but I just look at that number, and New York completely stands out like a sore thumb. They have a very low reported percentage of nursing home deaths, which means a very high percentage of other kinds of deaths. And I think the story that you're telling, based on what you witnessed, indicates that there was a whole lot of dying taking place in some New York City hospitals. And then to bring this full circle, something that you said that's so important, and maybe we'll end on this, is that the rest of the country has been looking at the New York experience and thinking that is the indicator of what the rest of the country can expect in terms of death and death rates and number of people dying from COVID. And it's so important that we heard Erin's story because we now know what was going on in some of these hospitals. It wasn't the best of care. People were put on vents too quickly. They didn't receive decent care in many cases. So that's some things for everybody to chew on. But people shouldn't look at New York City and say, well, that's coming to our town or our city. That's how it's going to be in our city. Erin, I live in the countryside. I looked it up. We have 99 people per square mile.
Wow.
And I see people walking down a country road. There's no other human being around for miles, and they're wearing a mask. And I want to cry. I'm like, what? Didn't anybody educate you about this?
They deserve to know the truth, so they don't have to live in fear. And there's mottos. We're in this together, and we can do it. We can get through it together. Like, why isn't anybody talking about this? A few people are, but I can't get a lot of news stations to even discuss this. And I think it's honestly, they just don't want to be wrong. and it doesn't fit the narrative. And it's unfair to the public to not be able to have both sides of this story and have to change their entire lives and have to lose, businesses that they built up their entire lives for. Not only did this affect, patients in these hospitals that died, it's affecting everybody at home too. Depression is huge. There's an increase in suicide. There's an increase in anxiety and, people being locked in their homes for months. It's not fair. It's not a way to live. And it's changing everything. Are our kids going to be forced to wear masks at school now? And all of these numbers are being attributed to the New York numbers. And the New York numbers aren't what they seem.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for what you've done to step forward. This is, guys, if you've never been a whistleblower, it's one of the hardest things on earth. It's almost easier to be in combat because, everybody's patting you on the back and, no one's going to question what you were doing. You had to do what you had to do and you did it. And but to stand up and say, okay, well, I was in this situation wherever it is, whether it's on a hospital or any place, and say things went wrong. With everybody telling you, shut up, don't talk about it, we don't want to hear about it. It's a very hard psychological stance to take. And you know what? Our society, our country, our communities, our children, our future, we can't have one without people willing to call things as they are. So, Erin, thank you a million for this. And we appreciate your time.
Yeah, I appreciate you listening, and I appreciate your time, and I appreciate everything you're doing too to get the truth out to people and let them decide on their own what they think